The night my mother sold my books, I stopped believing that love always protects. I was 17, still holding on to the kind of faith that home should be safe, that a mother's love could never feel like betrayal. When I came home from school that day, the air in the house was heavy. Something felt wrong even before I saw it. My shelf, the one I'd spent years filling with my favorite books, was empty. Only lines of dust remained, outlining the places where my dreams once stood. My mother sat at the table, counting money, her fingers moving quickly as if the bills might fly away. "Where are my books?" I asked. She didn't even look up. "I sold them," she said flatly. "You don't read anymore. We needed cash." Her tone was practical, not cruel, but the words still split me in half. I waited for her to soften, to say she was joking, but she didn't. "They were just books," she added, with the finality of someone who'd made peace with her choice. "Just books." Those two words echoed through me like a shout in an empty room. To her, they were paper. To me, they were proof that I existed beyond this small, tired house. They were the only things that felt like mine, the pages that carried my dreams, my hope, and the belief that one day I'd write my own story. I remember standing there, unable to speak, as if words themselves had betrayed me too. I went to my room and sat in front of the shelf for hours. The air smelled like dust and rain. I touched the marks where my books had been, trying to imagine their weight, their smell, their stories. I didn't cry at first. The pain was too deep for tears. It was anger that filled me instead. Quiet, sharp, and steady. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window with my old notebook, the one thing she hadn't touched. The streetlight outside flickered, throwing long shadows across the wall. I opened to a blank page and wrote a single sentence. "One day, I'll build something you can't sell." I didn't know what that meant yet, but it felt like a promise to the version of me she didn't see. The next morning, while she was in the shower, I found a folded receipt in her purse, a pawn shop slip. I stood there staring at it, my hands shaking. I walked barefoot to the address on the paper, feeling every pebble cut into my feet. The man behind the counter looked at me kindly. "They're gone," he said. "Sold cheap, $2 each." $2. That was the price of every story that once made me believe in myself. I walked home slowly, the morning sun already too bright. On the way, I passed the small bookstore where I used to spend hours reading for free. I stood outside and watched people buying new books, their faces calm and happy. For a moment, I felt like I didn't belong in that world anymore. But then I thought, no, I'll build my own place there someday. When I got home, she was laughing on the phone with a friend. I didn't say a word. I just watched her, realizing that she would never understand what she'd taken from me. But, for the first time, I also understood something she couldn't take. My will. I wasn't angry anymore. I was awake. That night, I tore out the page with my promise and taped it to the empty shelf. The paper fluttered with the wind from the window, and I whispered, "When someone burns your wings, don't stop flying. Build your own sky." That was the night my grief turned into resolve. The girl who cried for her books didn't disappear. She just learned to trade tears for determination. I learned how to carry heavy things quietly. After that day, life didn't. Pause for heartbreak. Bills still came, lights still flickered, and my mother still shouted my name when she needed help. Nothing outside me had changed, but everything inside had. I stopped arguing. I stopped asking. I became the kind of daughter who did what she had to do, not because she wanted to, but because survival didn't wait for softness. I got a part-time job at a local bakery after school. I cleaned tables, washed trays, and smiled at customers who never saw the exhaustion behind my eyes. The smell of sugar and bread always reminded me of warmth, but for me, it was just the scent of escape. I saved every coin I earned, folding the money carefully in an envelope with my name written on it. My mother never asked where it came from, and I never told her. At night, when she fell asleep, I sat by the window with that same old notebook. I didn't write stories anymore. I wrote plans. I made lists, things I wanted to learn, things I wanted to become. The words looked small, but they felt powerful. I promised myself that if I couldn't depend on anyone, I would depend on discipline. Hope was fragile, habits were not. There were days when I hated her, truly hated her, not because she sold my books, but because she made me doubt my worth. But even in that hatred, there was a strange understanding. She wasn't evil. She was broken in ways I was just beginning to see. Her love was shaped by fear, and fear makes people cruel. By the time I turned 18, I had 3 jobs. Mornings at the bakery, evenings at a bookstore, and weekends helping in a printing shop. I'd watch customers buy new books, and something inside me would ache. But I also learned something new. How stories were printed, how covers were designed, how ideas became real things. I didn't know it then, but those tiny lessons were building my future brick by brick. One night, after a long shift, I came home late. My mother was waiting at the door, angry. "Where were you?" she asked. Her voice wasn't worried. It was offended, like my independence insulted her. "Working," I said quietly. She looked me up and down, then said, "You'll thank me one day for being strict." I smiled, not because I agreed, but because I realized something. She was never going to understand me, and that was okay. At the bookstore, I started helping customers find the right books, and sometimes they'd ask for recommendations. The first time a woman said, "You have good taste in stories," I went home smiling. It was a small thing, but it felt like healing. Every kind word from a stranger was a thread pulling me back together. I learned the psychology of silence, how staying calm could be louder than shouting. I learned that not every battle needs a witness. Some victories happen when you stop explaining yourself. I didn't talk to anyone about my past. I just worked, learned, and built. Months passed, and I earned enough to move into a tiny apartment. 1 room, a small window, and a desk big enough for my notebook. The day I moved, I wrote 1 sentence on the wall above my desk. "The weight I carried for her will become the strength I carry for myself." Sometimes, late at night, I'd still think about that empty shelf. But instead of pain, I felt gratitude. She had sold my books, yes, but she had also sold my illusions. And maybe that was what I needed most. The girl who once cried over lost pages was now writing new ones, with her own pen, in her own space, under her own name. The apartment I moved into was small, too small according to the landlord, but to me, it felt like space for breathing. It had 1 window that looked out over a narrow street and a desk that wobbled every time I touched it. There were cracks in the ceiling, but they looked like constellations when I stared at them at night. For the first time in my life, I could close a door and know that the silence behind it belonged only to me. It took me 2 days to move everything I owned, 2 suitcases, a pillow, a blanket, and my old notebook. I placed it on the desk first, like an old friend taking the first seat in a new life. The first night there, I didn't sleep. I made tea on a small gas stove and sat on the floor, listening to the sound of the city breathing outside my window. No shouting, no judgment, no ghosts from the past, just me. The job at the publishing startup came by accident. I had been delivering pastries to an office nearby when a woman named Farah noticed my notebook sticking out of my bag. "You write?" she asked. I told her I used to before life happened. She smiled and said, "Come by our office tomorrow." That single invitation changed everything. At first, they gave me small tasks, editing lists, fixing typos, printing manuscripts, things no one else wanted to do. But I didn't mind. I loved the smell of ink and paper, the quiet rustle of pages. The people there were kind in ways I wasn't used to. They said please and thank you. They noticed when I stayed late. For someone who had grown up invisible, that attention felt like sunlight. Every night after work, I would return to my apartment and write again. Slowly at first, just paragraphs, half scenes, half memories. I wrote about the girl who lost her books, about the mother who couldn't love gently, about the ache that turns into ambition. I wasn't writing for anyone else. I was writing to understand myself. One evening I showed a piece to Farah. She read it silently, then looked up with tears in her eyes. "This is beautiful," she whispered. "You should publish it." The idea scared me. I wasn't ready to show the world my scars, but her words planted something in me. Belief. For the first time, someone other than me thought I was capable of something great. Weeks turned into months. My apartment slowly filled with life. A small bookshelf, a lamp from a thrift shop, a plant I named Hope. Every new thing I bought wasn't just furniture. It was proof that I was building something on my own terms. I stopped counting the things I'd lost and started noticing the things I was creating. Sometimes, though, when it rained, I would still think of my mother. I'd imagine her sitting in that same kitchen, the money from my books long spent. I wondered if she ever thought about what she had taken from me. But I didn't hate her anymore. The pain had turned into distance. Quiet, necessary distance. One night, while walking home, I passed a bookstore window. Inside, I saw a young girl holding a novel close to her chest, like it was a treasure. I smiled, remembering what that used to feel like. Maybe someday she'd read something I wrote. Back in my apartment, I taped a new line under my old note. No ghosts live here anymore. It wasn't revenge that kept me going. It was peace. The kind that comes when you finally stop waiting for apologies and start writing your own ending. The knock came on a rainy afternoon. The kind of slow, hesitant knock that doesn't belong to strangers. I was reviewing manuscripts at my desk, sipping cold coffee when I heard it. For a second, I froze. The rhythm of it, 2 slow knocks, 1 pause, felt like a ghost from another life. I opened the door and there she was. My mother. She looked smaller than I remembered. The sharpness that once filled her voice had softened into something that looked like exhaustion. Her hair was thinner, her eyes searching. She smiled, unsure, like someone testing if the word daughter still meant anything. "Emily," she said, almost whispering. For a long moment, I didn't speak. I just stood there staring at the woman who once told me my dreams were worth $2. The woman who taught me silence by forcing it on me. I expected to feel anger or at least satisfaction. But what I felt was calm, like looking at an old photograph that no longer hurts. "Can I come in?" she asked. I stepped aside. The apartment smelled of fresh paper and coffee, everything she never associated with me. She looked around, her eyes pausing on the bookshelf. It was full now, lined with books I had bought myself, and a few that had my name printed on the spine. "You've done well," she said quietly. I nodded. I had to. She sat down slowly, her hands trembling. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said, "but I'm not doing well. The shop went under. The bills?" Her voice cracked, and for the first time I saw her not as a villain, but as a tired, broken woman who had run out of choices. "I know," I said softly. "I read about it." Her eyes widened. "You did?" I smiled faintly. "It's part of my job now to read about companies that fail. I'm the acquisitions editor for Brightleaf Publishing." She blinked, confused. "That's the company that bought mine." I nodded again. "Yes, I led that deal." The room went silent. The sound of rain against the glass was the only thing moving. She looked at me the way I used to look at her, helpless and ashamed. I could see it on her face, the slow realization that she no longer had power over me. "You bought my company?" She whispered. "I didn't buy it," I said. "I rescued what was left of it. The people who worked there still needed jobs." She looked down at her hands. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to," I replied. "There was a time when I wanted an apology, but I learned that closure isn't something you wait for. It's something you create." She started to cry, soft and broken, the way I used to when no one was watching, and I realized that maybe we were both victims of our own pride. I made tea and placed a cup in front of her. For once, she didn't tell me how to do it better. She just said, "Thank you." When she stood to leave, she looked around the apartment one last time. Her eyes rested on the note taped to the shelf behind my desk, the same one I'd written years ago. "One day I'll build something you can't sell." Her lips parted, but she said nothing. She just nodded. As she walked out, I didn't feel revenge. I felt peace, the kind that comes when you no longer need to prove anything. She had taught me how to survive. Life had taught me how to live. When the door closed, I whispered, "Goodbye, Mom," and went back to work. Silence used to frighten me. It reminded me of the nights when I would sit in my room, trying not to cry too loud, afraid she might hear and call it weakness. But now silence feels different. It's not empty anymore, it's full. Full of peace, of breath, of everything I built from the noise she left behind. Weeks passed after that knock. My mother and I didn't talk again. She didn't call and I didn't reach out. It wasn't anger keeping us apart this time. It was understanding, the quiet kind that comes when two people finally stop expecting the other to change. Some love stories end not with forgiveness or revenge, but with distance that feels merciful. At work, life went on. The publishing house grew under my direction, and the company I'd acquired, the one that used to be hers, was thriving again. Sometimes I'd see her old employees walking through the hallways, unaware that the girl whose books had once been sold now signed their paychecks. I never told them. Some victories belong in silence. One afternoon, while cleaning my desk, I found my old notebook, the same one that survived everything. The first page still had the line I wrote years ago. "One day, I'll build something you can't sell." I smiled reading it. I had done exactly that, but now the words felt less about revenge and more about creation. I didn't build my life to prove her wrong. I built it to prove that I could exist without her approval. That evening, I walked home through the same streets I used to take when I worked at the bakery. Everything looked smaller now, the shops, the lights, even the fears I once carried. I passed by a small bookstore and stopped at the window. A girl, maybe 16, stood inside holding a copy of my book. She smiled as she read the back cover, then carried it to the counter. I stood there for a moment, frozen between disbelief and gratitude. When I got home, I sat by the window watching the city lights flicker like fireflies. I thought about my mother, not with pain, not with anger, but with a quiet acceptance. Maybe she would always be a storm I had to outgrow. Maybe she had to break me so I could learn how to build myself. I poured myself a cup of tea and walked to the shelf. It was full now. Books, awards, and that same torn note taped to the side. The paper was old and yellowed, but the ink still read strong. "One day, I'll build something you can't sell." Under it, I placed a new note. "I forgive you not because you asked, but because I deserve peace." Silence filled the room again, but this time it didn't hurt. It felt like music, soft, invisible, and steady, the kind of sound only healing can make. As I turned off the lights, I realized that I didn't need her to see me succeed. I didn't even need her to say sorry. The woman who once stood broken by her mother's choices had finally become her own definition of whole. The next morning, I woke up early, made coffee, and opened the window. The sun slipped gently into the room, touching the words on my note like a blessing. I smiled and whispered to myself, "This silence, that's my freedom."